to the sanctioning of chattel slavery. Now, the power exercised by these bulls would be inconsequential if the power of the one who authorized them was not already well known and firmly established. In fact, the title and the power of the Pope became so great that it defied the very scriptures that the Catholic Church claimed to be founded upon. In the centuries leading up to Columbus's voyage, we see the true colors of the Roman Catholic Church's agenda revealed. It was not for merely spreading the gospel, but rather for a more sinister plot for world domination.
We see the full power of the Pope documented in sources like the Prompta Bibliotheca by Lucius Ferraris, where he defines the Pope as of such great dignity and so exalted that he is not mere man, but as it were God, and the vicar of God. Hence the Pope is crowned with a triple crown as King of heaven and of earth and of the lower regions. As to papal authority, the Pope is, as it were, God on earth, sole sovereign of all the faithful of Christ, chief King of kings, having a plenitude of unbroken power, entrusted by the omnipotent God to govern the earthly and heavenly kingdoms. The Pope is of so great authority and power that he is able to modify, declare, or interpret even divine laws.
The last I checked, there was only one King of heaven, but we see the continuation of this in the way that people reverence the Pope now. He's only a man. In fact, the very word Catholic comes from the Greek word katholikos, which means universal. But universal why? A deeper look into the decrees set forth by the Church, and we understand why.
Papal Bull Unum Sanctum, the One Holy, written November 18, 1302 by Pope Boniface VIII, states the following. Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff. Papal Bull Dum Diversas, Until Different, written June 18, 1452, Pope Nicholas V says, we grant you, kings of Spain and Portugal, by these present documents with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. Papal Bull Integer Terra, among the other, first issued on March 13, 1456 to King Alfonso V of Portugal by Pope Calixtus III, was ratified on May 4, 1493 to address both Portugal and Spain in their discoveries. Pope Alexander VI states the following. In our times, especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion, be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. All islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered towards the west and south, by drawing and establishing a line from the north to the south, the said line to be distant 100 leagues toward the west and south from any of the islands commonly known as the Azores and Cape Verde.
How does one divide the earth according to how they see fit? This is also proof that they had knowledge of the so-called New World or hidden lands prior to Columbus's discovery. So for just a moment, let's reflect on what we were told in school. They tell us that the native inhabitants of the Americas were savages, that they were void of any advanced civilization or higher forms of culture, that they lacked any written language. These are what we hear time and time again. But if you notice, we never hear it directly from the source. If we want a more accurate account of who these people were, should we hear it from those that first encountered them before the genocide took place, before the displacement of millions of people to other lands and slavery and all of the tragic events that followed Columbus's arrival? Let's take a look at what Columbus and those who sailed with him documented about these native peoples.
They do not practice idolatry. On the contrary, they believe that all strength, all power, in short, all blessings are from heaven. They are neither lazy nor awkward, but on the contrary, are of an excellent and acute understanding. Those who have sailed these seas give excellent accounts of everything, but they have never seen men wearing clothes or ships like ours. In all these islands, there's no difference in the appearance of the inhabitants, and none in their customs and language, so that all understand one another. I found among them no monsters, as very many expected, but men of great deference and kind. Bernie Cobo, in his Historia del Nuevo Mundo, thought the Indians all came from the same stock. He based his opinions largely on a belief that the Indians did possess certain traits in common. But beyond the cultural similarities, Cobo argued that the physical similarities of the Indians was also of great importance. They all had the same color, somewhat brown. It is also said that Columbus called the Indians Indios, because when he first encountered them, he saw them living en Dios, in God.
In Dios.
There is a great argument that the people of these islands and continent are very ancient. The language of the island of Santo Domingo is corrupt Hebrew. We were amazed on account of the great towers and temples and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. One puzzling aspect of the early thinking concerning Indian origins is the lack of any serious consideration of the possibility that the Indians descended from the 10 lost tribes of Israel. It is generally believed to have been the most obvious and thus the earliest explanation of men in America.
It's not until Columbus's third or fourth voyage that we begin to see all of these vicious acts of genocide, pillage, rape, and enslavement. His first encounters remained relatively amicable. He was plotting on how to overcome the peaceful multitude, and at the same time, he and his companions were still awestruck at everything that they encountered. So in all reality, there was no justification for overtaking these people. Remember, the Catholic Church's edict that was sent forth declared that they only had authority to take over lands in which people were uncivilized and had no faith in God. The only problem is that the only notations that were taken down by Columbus and his peers all pointed to the fact that the Native Americans were a God-fearing people and could quite possibly be the children of Israel. So how is it that you can justify the mass slaughter and pillage of these people when they are the very children of God that the Roman Catholic Church claims to be a friend of? The only way that this can begin to take effect is if someone begins to lie. This is where the propaganda sets in.
Francisco López Gomara, secretary and biographer of Hernando Cortés, in his Historia General de las Indias, 1554, writes the following. Their principal god is the devil. They engage in public sexual intercourse like animals and are the greatest sodomists. They are liars, ingrates, and the source of syphilis, cannibals, and know nothing of justice. They go shamelessly nude, stupid, wild, insensate asses, prone to novelties, drunkenness, vice, and fickleness. They are the worst people that God ever made. Gomara wrote his book in part to persuade the Council of the Indies that they do not deserve liberty, and consequently decided they should be enslaved.
And it's funny, because when you do a comparative analysis of all of these accounts, they couldn't oppose each other more. They are polar opposites. So you have to wonder, which do you trust? What's fact? What's fiction? Fortunately, we have whistleblowers of that time to refer to. And when comparing the writings of the earliest works, we find that they're generally of more of a positive report. And as time goes on, they become increasingly more bigoted and outlandish.
Some of the earliest defenders of indigenous peoples' rights throughout the Americas were Bartolomé de las Casas, Antonio de Montesinos, and Peter Martyr. These men openly rejected the treatment of the natives at the hand of the European conquerors and documented the horrific realities of life for native people in the so-called New World. This chart shows the extent to which this kind of information was suppressed. All of these authors were whistleblowers and held to the notion that the native inhabitants of the Americas were not savages. Is it a coincidence that all of their works were published posthumously? In some cases as much as 400 years after they wrote it? Or did the powers that be deliberately hold back their work so as not to alter the propaganda agenda? An excerpt from Las Casas, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. They, the Spaniards, forced their way into native settlements, slaughtering everyone they found there, including small children, old men, pregnant women, and even women who had just given birth. They hacked them to pieces, slicing open their bellies with their swords as though there were so many sheep herded into a pen. They even laid wagers on whether they could manage to slice a man in two at a stroke, or cut an individual's head from his body, or disembowel him with a single blow of their axes. They grabbed suckling infants by their feet and, ripping them from their mother's breast, dashed them headlong against the rocks. Others, laughing and joking all the while, threw them over their shoulders into a river, shouting, "Wriggle, you little perisher."
Shabbat shalom, my Dula. Shabbat shalom, King. Shabbat shalom, Simeon.
Through a mother and her baby with a single thrust of their swords. They spared no, erecting especially wide gibbets on which they could string their victims up with their feet just off the ground.
Hey, if you brothers are wondering what am I watching, this is a documentary put together by the brother MASHAYACH called Despierta Magenta, which is the diaspora. I don't think the brother have any more of these copies out here, and that's why I'm doing little short recordings of it. But this is talking about the 10 tribes of Israel, dealing with some history. I just did a class this past Wednesday based on a book called Christopher Columbus and the Holocaust of the Indigenous People of America by Dr. John Henry Clark. So, I've been on this kick recently and all of that. So, Shabbat Shalom. This is how I'm starting my morning out, chilling, just getting my history back up to par. All right, Shalom.
And then burned them alive 13 at a time in honor of our Savior and the 12 apostles. Or tie dry straw to their bodies and set fire to it. Some they chose to keep alive and simply cut their wrists, leaving their hands dangling, saying to them, "Take this letter," meaning that their sorry condition would act as a warning to those hiding in the hills. The way they normally dealt with the native leaders and nobles was to tie them to a kind of griddle consisting of sticks resting on pitchforks driven into the ground, and then grill them over a slow fire, with the result that they howled in agony and...
Yo, did y'all just hear that madness? Man, they took wood and pitchforks and dug little areas and put the men in there and set them on fire, man. The white man is the devil that the Bible speaks of. He is truly the son of perdition. God damn it.
They died a lingering death.
So if the truth continues to be suppressed, and the only works that are being published are those bearing false witness or of an extreme bias, then what would the average person's viewpoint be concerning the natives in that day? Especially those who never even visited the Americas. If all they're reading is lies, then lies will continue to spread. It was more lucrative because books were being published and the exploitation of native lands and people continues to be justified. As time goes on, we see highly esteemed scholars of the day taking interest on the cultures of the native peoples, and they begin to develop different rubrics on how to accurately assess where the true origins of these people came from. This is when we see people like Gregorio Garcia enter the scene and have a profound influence on the literature of the day, so much so as to even develop his own tradition known as the Garcia tradition, some of which still stands until this very day.
When we study Garcia's tradition, he set forth 3 principles that guided the theories he developed. We will take a greater look into the 3rd principle. Fundamental number 3 concerned the ways of knowing. All philosophers and theologians, Christian and Gentile alike, agree that all knowledge comes by one of 4 ways or methods: science, opinion, divine faith, and human faith. Whatever we know by fe humana, human faith, has no other basis for its truth than the authority of whoever said it. If it is said by a serious, faithful man whose authority we trust, we may accept what is said. But if it's said by someone of little or no authority, we should consider it false, or at least doubt that it is true. From all this, we can understand the truth of the Castilian proverb, which says, "El creer es cortesía."
Who has more authority in this instance, the native man or the European? Ask yourselves this question right now in the 21st century, and you'll find the same answer. This goes to show how much these ideologies permeated the minds of the people. Understanding that our entire school system was established and continues to be maintained by European standards, we can see why these things are still the case. Because mainstream academia now is just a continuation of the racist logic that once ruled. As time progresses, we see more of the same attempts to hide truth in order to prolong injustice. But the attempts become more overt and impactful. One such example is that of Joseph de Acosta of the Jesuit order under the Roman Catholic Church.
Joseph de Acosta was a Jesuit missionary that was sent to Latin America and lived amongst the native people of Peru and New Spain, Mexico, for over 15 years. Throughout his experience in the New World, he documented everything from native customs to the unique landscape and animals that lived in the New World. This compilation of writings was entitled Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias and would become one of the most influential publications on the New World. Note that his work was published only 4 years after he wrote it. In Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, Acosta would not only postulate an entirely new theory for how the Native Americans arrived to the Americas, but also created a new standard for determining the origins of the native people. Keep in mind that the use of archaeology with comparative anatomy and ethnology to produce a scientific study of early man did not start until the late 19th century. As a result, most conclusions were subjective and based upon the author's ability to analyze culture.
This man's work remains doctrine unto this day, despite the fact that all of his claims can be disproven with modern science.
Acosta was the first to state that the most probable route of migration for the native people of the Americas was through the Bering Strait. He based this upon his own theory that somehow animals had come to the New World, and he guessed that man followed the same route. It should be noted that Acosta proposed this theory roughly 100 years before any substantial exploration and study.
Hey, this finna debunk all them lies out there in Israel that the Native Americans are Eskimos and all of that other stuff, and that they're mongrels and all that. This finna debunk that knowledge, man. Get y'all information up, family. I ain't gonna be too much longer on this video, man. I'm just telling y'all, man, if y'all wanna learn, man, y'all need to get with us and learn this truth. You know what I'm saying? The truth is the true faith. It is the true gospel. James 1:1, to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. Greetings, brethren. James 1:1. Let's get it.
On the Bering Strait land bridge. So we must ask ourselves, how credible is this theory if it was never rooted in any factual evidence? Acosta was also one of the first to uphold an isolationism theory with regards to pre-colonial migration and cultural activity in the so-called New World. By 1650, the writers on the Acostan tradition were willing to derive the Indians from some unknown tribe in northeastern Asia at an unknown but ancient time. This position is substantially identical to that accepted by most modern authorities.
Isolationism and the Bering Straits theories, keyword theories, have been some of the most damaging and untruthful doctrines passed on through academia. Because through these two theories, the gatekeepers of higher education have made it almost impossible to link the natives back to their true Eastern origins. And the worst part about it is that they're not true. Modern science, archaeology, and historical documentation all prove against it.
See that? They're not from Siberia.
Group X is really a fascinating story because the X-Files of Native American genetics, because it burst on the scene in 1998. Scientists didn't want to believe it, but they found a new haplogroup in addition to A, B, C, D, Indians of the Great Lakes in particular, and that was haplogroup X. And so immediately the scientists who have a kind of idée fixe, in my opinion, set about trying to find haplogroup X in Mongolia and Siberia, because of course all American Indians, all upstanding American Indians came across the Bering Land Bridge chasing woolly mammoths, right? So they weren't able to find haplogroup X in Siberia. They found one case of it. That wasn't enough. Haplogroup X was a Eurasian type. So then they started talking about, oh, well, maybe they got here by jumping across the ice in a circumpolar fashion. Okay. Well, it kind of rested there for a while. As it turned, and last year, finally, the mystery of haplogroup X was revealed in a very important study by a team under Dr. Schluss, and he determined without any doubt that the origin of haplogroup X was the hills of Galilee. It's that clear. That's where, because where you have the greatest...
Yo, did y'all just hear that? The Native American DNA, haplogroup X, originates from the land and the ghettos and the streets of Galilee and Israel. All praises to YAHAWASHI, YAHAWASHI, Barakatah. Let's end that speculation.
Greatest diversity you have, that's the origin.
There's no controversy among DNA experts about the Middle Eastern origin of haplogroup X. And the question really is, when did it arrive in the Americas?
Most projections about ancient human history, prehistory really, are based on a mathematical and statistical model called phylogenetics.
What we find in the journals is that it is commonly thought among DNA experts that there was an outmigration of haplogroup X from the Middle East about 40,000 years ago.
That's a pure projection. You know, it's a mathematical progression going back to there based on how mitochondrial DNA mutates. Is it true? Who knows?
But what most people don't realize is that among these same experts in these same journals, there is controversy about the dating. So,
you know, I think these are projections.
The controversy is between those who assume a theory that man branched from chimps 5 to 6 million years ago versus those who are using newer actual findings from DNA pedigree studies. The theoretical dating gives much longer time frames, but the actual data shows a 20-fold reduction and would place the Middle Eastern outmigration of haplogroup X about 2,000 years ago.
Damn.
Demonstrates theory. Prior to the invention of it, the only serious consideration of how the natives came to the Americas was that they arrived by ships. And if we take Columbus's notion and those who were part of that first generation contact with the natives, we have to refer back to the book of 2nd Esdras to see what they believe to be true. When we follow the scripture, it tells us that they entered in the narrow places of the river, which when you look at the Euphrates, it begins where the Assyrian Empire was situated, and those are the narrowest parts of it. It widens as it flows downward and finally empties into the Persian Gulf, which leads to the Arabian Sea and ultimately flows into the Pacific Ocean. Now, if we follow its route, what's interesting is that we find groups of people throughout the Middle East, into Asia, and even into the Pacific Islands that claim to be of Hebrew stock, particularly descendants of the northern tribes. The Aboriginal people of India, like the Dalit, which actually means oppressed, the Negritos of the Philippines, and those of Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Hawaii. When you look into their past, all have resemblance in culture of the Israelites spoken of in the scriptures. In fact, there was a book published in 1811 entitled Star in the East, written by Dr. Claudius Buchanan, a missionary from the Church of England that was sent to East India and claimed that the Aboriginal people bore a striking resemblance to the Israelites spoken of in the Bible. In addition, when you research the origins of all the people, There's no concrete answer as to how they got there. It's all very murky, much like they say about the origins of the people in the Americas. When we follow the map, it's almost as if the northern tribes made strategic pit stops along the way, and some apparently remained in those lands and never continued to sail on. But the ones that did would eventually land in the midwestern region of South America, or what is known today as Peru. These tribes would begin to spread north and eastward shortly thereafter. As the scripture indicates, the northern tribes had a great way to go, and even with the help of God keeping the waters calm, it took them over 1.5 years of sea time to get to their final destination at Etzaret, or Arsaret. Interestingly enough, the most ancient artifacts and evidence of human civilization comes from the Peruvian region, and there's actually no substantiating evidence that masses of people ever passed through the Bering Straits. To say that all natives of the Americas came from some unknown territory in northeastern Asia and suddenly migrated through the coldest places on Earth is asinine, especially when we take into account that the theory was developed before any European had even traveled to the Bering Strait, and the practice of archaeology had not even been invented. Many of these theories are just clever ways to detract from the overwhelming evidence of truth. Once the powers that be fund a particular theory or concept, it can be very easily promoted as fact, as we have seen all throughout history. According to logic and historical evidence, the route mentioned in 2nd Esdras would prove much more plausible. However, that is not the case. Could this be why 2nd Esdras was removed from the Bible? Fast forward to the late 19th century, and we see the propaganda machine begin to shift gears.
Pay attention, people.
It no longer has to justify the mass genocide of the native peoples. We now see the institutionalization of misinformation. For example, the Smithsonian Institute.
I think the answer to that question is pretty complex, but it's ingrained in the history of the 20th century. The answer to the question is not just a simple, oh, this is obfuscation, or this is just ignorance, or this is just the limits of our education. That's not an adequate answer to why history is buried like this, why history is damned like this. I mean, you study these objects, you feel like you're part of fringe science or something. You're dismissed as a diffusionist or something like that. You probably are going to get a knock on the door from the men in black. Why is that? And the answer goes back into American history and to the origins of the Smithsonian, which was supposed to sort out American history. But the Smithsonian quickly became an ivory tower and a place for not so much investigating history as forming a defense against popular history. So you even hear archaeologists today complain and say archaeology should not be the province of people, ordinary mortals. It's reserved to the people at Harvard and Peabody and Washington, D.C. There's a book called Fantastic Archaeology. So if you want to see all the controversial objects all in one place in a little museum of the damned, open the pages of Stephen Williams' Fantastic Archaeology. He used to teach a course at Harvard. And so in the course, I'm sure there were many, many laughs from the students when they came to Los Lunas Decalogue Stone. That's in there, and that's called a glorious fraud. The Tucson objects, artifacts are also in there, and they're called forgeries. Never mind, we don't know who forged them, they're forgeries, they just have to be. The Bat Creek Stone, all the other good stuff in American history is in that book. So if you want it all in one place, get that book. And so why is this? You know, why should it? Every single one, unfailingly, one after another, have to be fake, have to be false, have to be forged, have to be wrong. You know, can so many people have everything so wrong? I don't think so.
Seal of the Smithsonian. You will see it has the same exact seal as the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuit Order, which operates under the Roman Catholic Church. And to no surprise, we see the same doctrines that were created by the Jesuit priest Acosta adopted by the Smithsonian Institute under their first director of ethnology, John Wesley Powell.
John Wesley Powell was the first director of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institute from 1879 to 1902. He was responsible for establishing the following doctrines, which ironically still hold true to this day, despite overwhelming evidence of the contrary. 1. Isolationism, which essentially states there was no communication between the so-called New World and Old World prior to Columbus. 2. The Bering Straits theory. 3. Illegitimized and discredited any pre-Columbian historical and cultural research. 4. Evolution. And 5. He was an advocate for manifest destiny. Due to the power and influence the Smithsonian would attain through government sanctioning, these doctrines would also be adopted and pushed through academic curriculum from the public school systems to Ivy League universities. Mr. Powell was once quoted as saying, "If once the memory of the thought to be preserved has passed from the minds of men, the record is powerless to restore its own subject matter."
Damn, wow.
Mr. Powell was very cunning in that he was able to add on to Acosta's doctrine by instituting the ideology that says any pre-Columbian artifact cannot be used for valid historical purposes.
In the monuments of antiquity found throughout North America, in camp and village sites, graves, mounds, ruins, and scattered works of art, the origin and development of art in savage and barbaric life may be satisfactorily studied. Incidentally, too, hints of customs may be discovered, but outside of this, the discoveries made have often been illegitimately used, especially for the purpose of connecting the tribes of North America with peoples or so-called races of antiquity in other portions of the world. Hence, it will be seen that it is illegitimate to use any pictographic matter of a date anterior to the discovery of the continent by Columbus for historic purposes.
These claims stand firmly till this day. And what makes it even worse is the fact that all of the major universities agree with the Smithsonian, not even taking into account that the doctrine in particular was founded purely on the basis of Powell's own personal racist viewpoints towards the natives. But thankfully, there's nothing hid that won't be revealed and nothing in the dark that won't come to light. Archaeology and even DNA science has proven to be the best antidote to the propaganda machine. As of the last decade, much interest has been placed on the topic of a group of stones and statues found in Puerto Rico. This archaeological discovery is most commonly known and referred to as La Biblioteca de YAHAWAH or Las Piedras de Padre Nazario.
José María Nazario y Cancel was born in Sabana Grande, Puerto Rico on September 8, 1838. In 1861, he earned a bachelor's with honors from the Seminario Conciliar in San Juan, studying philosophy with a focus in moral theology. Shortly thereafter, he attended graduate school in Salamanca, Spain, where he would become an ordained priest and lend his time to the advanced study of the biblical languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Choosing to conduct his missionary work back home, he returned to YAHAWASHI, Puerto Rico in 1866, where he served as a priest to the people for 32 years. Through his service, he built a strong connection and trust with the people of the community. It is documented that in 1880, as he was tending to an elderly woman on her deathbed, she confessed to him that she had knowledge of a collection of stones that had been passed down through the lineage of caciques on the island. She trusted that the priest would protect these stones and gave him the location. To Nasario's surprise, the hidden location contained a massive collection of 800 engraved stones.
800.
The father would spend the rest of his life deciphering the stones and enlisting the opinions of expert archaeologists from all over the world. Little did he know this would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in the Americas. He died believing the stones were authentic, of a Hebraic origin, and when placed in order, told the history of the native Taínos in the island of Borinquen.
After Nasario had the opportunity to study the stones and transcribe their writings, he came to the conclusion that the stones were of Hebraic origin and that the Taínos must have been descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel. He also shared this discovery with the world, and the stones quickly gained much popularity. Institutions and governments throughout the world came to investigate the authenticity of the stones. Representatives from France, the Dominican Republic, and the US all came to see. In fact, a man by the name of Narciso Arbenzi Bosch of the Dominican Republic, a pioneer in archaeological discoveries in that island, came to Puerto Rico to view the stones and claimed that he found similar writings in the caves of the Dominican Republic. He also agreed with the notion that the stones were authentic. However, to no surprise, when the Smithsonian reviewed these stones, Barry Fuchs, the second director of ethnology, claimed the stones to be a forgery. He said the priests paid jibaros to write on the stones.
Wow.
Jesse Walter Fuchs succeeded Powell as the second director of ethnology for the Smithsonian Institute. He had the privilege of meeting with Padre Nasario and studying the entire collection, and with no substantial reasoning as to why, he disagreed with Nasario's views on the stones and concluded that they were a forgery.
See that?
He claimed
See that?
the locals were paid money to engrave the stones. What's interesting is that it has been documented that Fuchs offered Padre Nasario $800.
Wait a minute, did y'all see that, man? Did y'all just see that? That looked like my man Alon in them, the tribe of Reuben. That looked like my Alon in them and Mother Adina in them pictures, for real, for real. You know what I'm saying? But here we go, let's get some more.
Of stones. Fortunately, Nasario denied the offer, but we must wonder, why would he be willing to pay $800 for a collection of forged stone inscriptions?
Now, logically speaking, we know these allegations to be false and solely based on his own racist views, much like his predecessor Powell. Unfortunately, the ruling of the Smithsonian suppressed the publicity of the stones, and after the death of Padre Nasario, the stones were taken into the hands of private collectors, museums, and other institutions. Not until recently, under the study of Dr. Raynel Rodriguez, have the stones come to surface in the public eye once again. In November of 2015, I was fortunate enough to take a trip to Puerto Rico and meet with the professor and view the stones for myself. Let's take a look.
Let's get it.
Try to understand him and how he engaged with the stones. And one of the interesting things is that, he was trying to decipher them until he died. So if they were a forgery, he didn't know about it. Actually, in this writing, he says, this is in 1905. I'm talking that the stones were found at least in 1881. So this is 24 years after the stones were found. He was trying to decipher the stones using a book that was called Caldea, that had a disc you know, where we had this images inscribed, and the book where this was inscribed, this was presented, was published in 1889. So he didn't have access to that image before the stones were found. So he was trying to study the stones and deciphering them after he found them with with new information. So and he continued to do that. You know, when Fuchs went to him, he actually gave them the monograph of his interpretation of the stones. And he said that the lost tribes of Israel, he continued to cling in his statement. Yeah, he stood with the lost tribes of Israel idea. And you know, for me, it was really interesting that I've been researching the collections, you know, and like a week ago, a friend of mine, he is a director, a curator in a museum in France, you know, because Alphonse Pinard took some pieces to different museums. And I said, man, you know, are these pieces there? He says, man, yeah, they're here, right? And in France, he found like 38 artifacts that the father had given to the priest. So he writes to me, hey, but the stones say YAHAWAH, Puerto Rico. I said, YAHAWAH, Puerto Rico? You know, YAHAWAH, what's YAHAWAH? You know, like I began researching YAHAWAH. And I began looking at, you know, historical documents, everything, right? And so I began saying, well, YAHAWAH, put it on the internet, you know. So YAHAWAH is a territory, you know, where the tribe of Ephraim was located. And so you know, like, I don't know if that's based on the idea that the priest had written, you know, or is an ancient name of a region in Puerto Rico, or what it is. I really don't know. But right now I am trying to see, okay, so this ties up with the idea that the priest was working on the lost tribes of it doesn't confirm it necessarily. It just says that the priest was using a name for stones that had to do, you know, the name was Pinard, but somebody has to do with this territory, is the northern boundary of this territory, you know, when you have the locations of all these of all the tribes, you know, and the northern fringe, you know, is related to this. And so, but the problem I've run to is, you know, that yeah, they're France and doesn't want to, you know, like, these studies that need to be done require like funding for dating the stones. So they require funding for going there and there. The Puerto Rican government is just don't want to deal with it. You know, like, it doesn't seem like nobody wants to, because
hey, just like in Mexico, same thing in Puerto Rico, same thing in Brazil. Those are Edomites, conquistadors that are still the governments of those lands. Ain't nothing changed. Same damn Romans.
Have, you know, I know that you look at it from more religious perspective, but in terms of history, just basic history, it would have like so profound implications. And what it would talk about is our capacities, you know, of our ancestors, our African, our indigenous ancestors, to interact, you know, form bonds, you know, bonds that perhaps stretch back into hundreds and hundreds of years. And but no, you know, the idea is that, you know, and this all happened, and based on what I've seen in terms of the relationships between the indigenous people of Puerto Rico and those of Central America, Colombia, and those from many other places, I know that there were, you know, people were moving around. They were
the efforts of governments, religious institutions, and racist ideologies to collude, to distort, to hide, or in some cases even destroy the artifacts and culture of the native people of the Americas, we still see an abundance of pre- and post-Columbian artifacts that bear a striking Eastern influence and origin. Let's look into some examples.
Archaeological discoveries throughout the quote-unquote New World, which point towards the fact that the natives of the Americas are of Hebrew origin. Many of these archaeological finds are ignored, swept under the rug, or labeled as a hoax without proper examination. Now, why is that? Many of these finds are kept hidden from the eyes of mainstream media because it contradicts what is generally accepted by mainstream academia and what they say is the origins of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. In the citadel of Uxmal in Mexico, you can see the symbol which some refer to as the Magen David or the Star of Moloch at the very top of the citadel. Also, the same symbol can be seen on the left ear of a stone carving of a native man in the Stela of Campeche, Mexico. In the book entitled The Medieval Empire of the Israelites by Robert Bresman and Vladimir Melamed, it speaks on an article written on December of 1974 in the Israeli newspaper. In this article, they mention a Jesuit priest named Nicholas Deltsu, who traveled to Argentina and encountered natives and who also practiced circumcision. Amongst these natives was found a stone slab with commandments on them which read, "Do not steal, do not kill, do not lie."
The Medieval Empire of the Israelites by Robert Grisham and Vladimir Melamed, pages 29 to 30, state the following. As regards the South American Indians and their possible relationship, an article was published in the Israeli newspaper Mariv, December 1974, with the following content. In 1587, the Jesuit Nicolas Deltsu was sent to South America by the King of Spain for missionary purposes to convert the Indians to Christianity. In Argentina, Nicolas discovered a people who bore Jewish names: Abraham, David, Moses, and so forth. They were circumcised. These people answered, yes, just like our ancestors. In this same region were found stone knives used for circumcision. Sharpened stone knives are mentioned also in the Bible as special instruments for completion of the rite of circumcision. The Argentinian tribe, where a stone slab with 3 commandments was found, causes no less interest. Do not steal, do not lie, and do not kill. One may assume that these commandments are from the Old Testament, and they appeared in these lands before the arrival of the Spaniards.
All right, family, I'm gonna end it right here, y'all. It'll be another upload later. Shalom, Shabbat Shalom.